Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. First of all, I would like to apologize to Anne, TM, and Molly, and all of you for the issues that we had with Zoom the last time around. I'm assured that it won't happen again. Remind everybody, my name is Adam Blackwell. I'm the Vice President, International Development Services Group, and on behalf of the team at the Global Terrorism Trends and Analysis Center, GTAC, I will be moderating this session. This is a continuation of a series of talks by eminent people in the field of terrorism. Just to remind everybody, the views expressed are those of the presenters. The title of today's presentation is White Supremacists Speak: Recruitment, Radicalization, and Experiences of Engaging and Disengaging from Hate Groups. I imagine after the events in Buffalo, nothing could be more timely than this presentation. Our speakers today are Anne Speckhard, PhD, and she is the director of the International Center for the Study of Violent Extremism and serves as an adjunct associate professor of psychiatry at Georgetown University School of Medicine. There's TM Garret, who is an extremism researcher and analyst at ICSVE. He is a German-American public speaker, human rights activist, consultant, author, extremism researcher, interfaith activist, and founder of Change, a nonprofit organization that engages in anti-racism and anti-violence campaigns. We also are joined today by Molly Ellenberg. Molly, I'm going to let you introduce yourself in 2 seconds. Just to remind everybody listening in, please get your questions ready. We will use the Q&A function in Zoom. And we should have about 20-30 minutes at the end for what I hope will be a dynamic conversation. So, Molly, if you would just like to take a couple minutes to introduce yourself, and then we'll hand it back to Anne and we'll get started.
Of course, yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Molly Ellenberg. I'm a research fellow at the International Center for the Study of Violent Extremism, and I'm also a PhD student at the University of Maryland studying social psychology. At ICSVE, I work on a lot of our counter-narrative campaigns, and I also do the data analysis for the interview research that we're going to be discussing today.
Excellent. So, Anne, I will hand the baton back to you. I will mute myself and leave it in your capable hands.
Okay. Glad to be here today. Thank you for inviting us. And we decided we're just going to speak from the slides, but we'll share them later. And this is a study of 50 white supremacists, which I made interviews with over the last, well, it was from October till October last year. So we started right before the Capitol Hill riots. And this study builds upon work that we had done with ISIS, where we made video interviews, and that work was funded by US State Department, the EU Commission, and mostly by the state of Qatar. So we based this research on that research, and we did a similar 2-hour in-depth interview with every person in the sample and asked them if they would agree to be video recorded, and at the end asked them if they would be willing to take part in a counter-narrative, meaning that from the 2-hour interview that we would cut pieces of it, and if they advised against being involved in extremism, later use that for prevention and intervention. And we have, I think, 2 videos today that we'll show you from that. So it's a research that's to inform the field, but also to create actual tools to start to fight against this kind of thing. So we were really pleased that we could get these 50 interviews, and that was by the help of Jeff Shoup and TM Garret and Ed Schofield, who all referred people into the sample for us. And TM translated for some of them as well. The sample is 50 people. There were 40 men, 9 women, 1 non-binary person. And they were 36 Americans, 5 Canadians, 5 Germans, 3 British, and 1 New Zealander. And they ranged in their ages from 24 to 70, and they had joined between 1978 and 2020. And they had joined between the ages of 5 to 56. And as Molly said, she does all the data analysis for us. So she went back through every single interview and coded them on 252 variables. And they reflected 6 discrete themes. And we did the same thing with our sample of ISIS, the 273. So it's interesting that we can compare the two. So she broke it up into 6 general themes: vulnerabilities, influences, motivations, roles in the group, experiences in the group, and sources of disillusionment. So we're dividing these slides between us, and I'll turn it over to Molly now.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so the first finding from these interviews that I'm going to discuss is their vulnerabilities. So these are things that happened prior to joining their groups that could have made them susceptible to influence, to recruitment, to radicalization based on these life experiences. And we found very high levels of adverse childhood experiences, which are a set of vulnerabilities that have been shown to predict a number of negative physical and mental health outcomes. And we found that this was the case in this sample, that they did have high levels of these adverse childhood experiences. So specifically, 23 of the 50 grew up in a house where one of the household members struggled with substance abuse. And after that, 28 of them eventually struggled with their own substance abuse as well. So very high levels there. 21 of the 50 lived in a one-parent household with parents who had divorced, separated, or never been married. 19 of them experienced physical abuse during childhood. Other experiences that might have been vulnerabilities for them in joining their groups were living in a household marked by family conflict and dysfunction, as well as specific prior traumatic experiences, including sexual abuse and assault, a cancer diagnosis, and the murder of a sibling. And so all of these left these gaps in their life where they felt that they didn't have a sense of meaning or purpose or significance in their lives. And so what we find when we look at their motivations as to why they joined their groups, it's not out of hatred or prejudice that they're seeking these groups out, but rather the most common motivations for joining their groups were more existential needs, being the desire to belong. This was reported by 32 of the 50 interviewees, as well as the need for significance, also noted by 32 of the interviewees. In contrast, only 13 interviewees were motivated by any type of bigotry, with very little overlap. 6 were motivated by racism, 8 were motivated by xenophobia, specifically against Mexican immigrants in the United States and Turkish immigrants in Germany. 7 were motivated by Islamophobia, and 5 were motivated by anti-Semitism. So all of these are really low numbers in comparison to the 32 that are motivated primarily by these existential needs that we all have. But once they were in their groups, they did learn the ideologies that are so hateful that we know today. So once they were in their groups, 13 people admitted to dehumanizing Muslims, 20 admitted to dehumanizing immigrants, 33 admitted to dehumanizing Black people, and 35, about 70%, admitted to dehumanizing Jews while they were in their groups.
So we call this process of adopting the white supremacist ideology directed hate. And it basically involves 3 steps. So first you find a group, maybe you were bullied in school, perhaps by a minority group, maybe had a bad experience, or you just don't fit in anywhere and you find a group that lets you in. And so they start to bond to this group out of needs of belonging, personal significance, dignity, wanting a noble cause, and as an outlet for their anger and a way to shift blame. And they're told, you are allowed into this group because you're special, you're white. And they bond over the belief that white people are superior, making membership in the white-only group exclusive and prestigious. So you're hurting in other parts of your life, as we told you, that a lot of these people were extremely vulnerable. And suddenly they're finding a purpose, they're finding meaning, they have a family where maybe they didn't have a family before, and they have a sense of what they're going towards. But as they get deeper into this, they're taught that minorities are trying to take over the world, and that there's an evil force behind this. It's the Jewish people. So this whole idea of what we just saw with the Buffalo shooter, who got, as he says, radicalized in 4chan, the whole idea that of white replacement or white genocide, that there won't be whites anymore, there'll be a minority group or displaced altogether, they'll be moved from their positions of power. But the argument is whites are superior, they should be in power. Minorities are, according to different theories, the spawn of Satan, like animals, and that there's this terrible, terrible evil force, which are the Jews. So as you'll see in some of these videos, maybe these people never even knew a Jew, never interacted with Jewish people, and suddenly they're shifting all their blame and all their hatred towards Jewish people and also towards minorities. And as time goes on, they begin to take part, or at least have to silently endorse and oftentimes vocally endorse violent actions towards minority groups and towards Jewish people. So let me show you one of our slides. This is of Ryan Lowry, who had just come back from the, oh, I guess I can't show it if we don't.
Black people aren't our friends. Look how white Europeans have flourished compared to black communities. I started to believe it. I think he was misunderstood, and that he made some mistakes. I didn't think he was a bad person. On the side, we were stealing boat motors. I was scared. My first time ever being in jail, I didn't know what to do. I had this huge swastika tattoo on my arm. Next thing I know, I get jumped, and I'm getting hit from everywhere, and I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know how to protect myself except for just to cover myself up. But the guys that were part of these hate groups didn't come over to save me. But the one person that did come over to help me out was my cellmate at the time, a black guy. I started to kind of reopen my eyes up to the fact that it didn't matter what color of skin you have, it don't matter where you come from. We all make mistakes, we all do stupid stuff, but we're human. Black.
Okay, so just to explain a little bit about that video, that was a very short one, a 1 minute. All of our videos are 5-minute videos, but when we campaign with them on Facebook, we cut them down to 1 minute. And I should say that TM is making most of our videos, and Molly campaigns with all of them on Facebook, and we study how many people watch them, what their comments are, and we get all kinds of metrics as to how impactful they are, and Molly can address that later. But anyway, is this the next slide in the slide deck? Okay, so the next one is that the idea of a noble cause is very powerful. So 17 of the people said that a motivation for them was believing that they were engaging in a noble cause and that they were going to save the white race. So not only did they believe that they were special and exclusive, but that they had an honorable cause. One even spoke of himself as a warrior for his race. And adherence to the 14 words, which I can never remember. TM, you want to call those out for us?
That is, we must secure the existence of our people and the future for white children.
Thank you. And that leads to people believing that they're not only acting in their own interest, but also in the interest of future generations. So let's see, I can't see the slide count, so I have the next 3, right, Molly? So White supremacist groups, as you can see, manipulate the needs and vulnerabilities of their recruits, and they also use cult-like indoctrination methods. So older men often act as father figures for lost young men, men that perhaps didn't have fathers. They're tough guys acting as protectors for white women. We had one young man who was bullied in school, and a group of white supremacists walked him to and from school to protect him. And of course, he thought that was great. And also men that don't have friends, that suddenly they're in a group and they have friends. One of our participants that almost shot up a synagogue, he had bought a gun to shoot up a synagogue, but he got caught by the FBI. It was in buying the gun, he was in a sting operation, thankfully. Otherwise, he would have carried it out. Said that when he went for his first KKK meeting, he was just euphoric. The idea that he had found a place to belong and that all these people were like him and cared about him, and that he had a place, and then over time beginning to believe that he had a noble cause. So he went and told his imperial wizard that he was going to shoot up the synagogue, and thankfully the wizard was involved with the FBI and turned him in. So they get a very strong sense of specialness, and also a feeling of being in on secret knowledge, that the rest of the world doesn't know this, but you've been allowed to know this. In the NSM, they actually get ranks. NSM is National Socialist Movement, and promotions, and that can give a sense of achievement, and is oftentimes something that former military really resonate to, that they have a rank and they can move up the ranks. Recruits are endowed with a heroic sense of purpose, as we said, saving the white race. And I would also say the whole thing speaks to saving their own inner child, that they had bad experiences, they had emotional deprivation and pain, and now they can do something about it. And as far as following cult-like practices, oftentimes they're demanded to cut off ties from those who don't adhere to the ideology. They certainly aren't supposed to mix races. The idea is that at some point there will be this racial holy war. There'll be the day of the rope, and at that time, all racial traitors will be hung. So they're supposed to stay in their strict in-group, the white group, reject all others. They have to go along with the ideology, even if they have doubts. Sometimes taking part in secret ceremonies, banding together for demonstrations, wearing uniforms or wearing marks, marking on their bodies indelibly, which is something that also needs to be addressed. And TM has started a really cool thing called Erasing the Hate, which helps tattoo parlors volunteer to take these marks of hatred off of the people that are coming out of these groups. Because as you can imagine, when you have indelible markers of hate, sometimes on your face, on really significant parts of your body, on your hands, shoulders, people are afraid of you and don't want to hire you for jobs and so on. So let's go to the next slide. Let's see. We also found that people that grew up in the South and had grown up around racism, it was much easier for them to go into these groups. So for instance, one of our respondents told us, growing up in the South, I was always a person, if you treated me good, I will treat you good, no matter the color of your skin. But growing up, my grandfather would say, you never saw a successful Black person. And that got in my mind. I was never in any white supremacism or ideology growing up. I think he actually was, but he didn't realize it. I would never mistreat anyone from a race, but being from the South, I had these preconceived ideas that white people are better. Just being born in the South, it made me susceptible to get involved in that stuff. And he was in the NSM, I think, for a good 10, 12 years and became a leader in the NSM. Another one said, I never considered myself a racist. I never hated anyone for the color of their skin. I had that instilled into me as a kid. My mom told me not to mix races. Whites are better than them, but never to hate. My grandfather was in the Klan. I don't remember, but we lived in the South. Most people were in the Klan. I played football in high school, and football deterred the hate away because the Blacks and Hispanics had my back on the field and off the field. I wore Confederate flags to school, but never hated anyone. So if you already have this in your background, it's really easy to go into it. But that certainly wasn't the case for everyone. Let's go ahead to the next slide. Oh, this is the next video. So if we could play that.
If somebody purchased like an abandoned town, we were all going to try to move there and create like a compound and try to restore it where it'd be a white civilization. I mean, I had that instilled in me as a kid. I remember my mom telling me, you know, not to mix races and that whites were better than them. On my leg, I have like the Iron Cross with the SS bolts. I wore Confederate flags and stuff to school, you know. I held many rallies. We would go and have rallies and we would invite the Klan. I was a volunteer firefighter at the time. So, I mean, I believed in helping anybody. I ended up leaving because I seen the organization wasn't going to change, and I was tired of having the label of you're just a racist neo-Nazi. I got fed up with it. Life's too short to hate everybody. If you'd actually sit down and talk to them, you'd find out you probably have a lot in common with people. There's somebody that
I'll just mention at the end of there, if they go to our website that links to all of these videos, then they find one page that lists all the places you can go for help and interventions. And we're starting to write blog posts so that they could read more, and all the other videos are also at that website. So they could watch many views of people like themselves that got involved in this and also got out, so they could start to understand it is possible to get out.
So I'll continue here. We discussed this a little bit and briefly before in talking about the process of directed hate, but that anti-Semitism was indoctrinated. It wasn't really pre-existing for most of the interviewees. 5 people were motivated, at least in part, by anti-Semitism, but none of them had been motivated by a negative experience with a Jewish person. Many of them had never met a Jewish person before. And when you look at census data, it's not surprising. There is not a single state in the United States with a Jewish population of over 10%. And I think 23 states have like less than 1% or something of that nature. So it's not super surprising that a lot of these people would have never come in contact with a Jewish person. And so once they're joining their groups, they're being indoctrinated with this hatred towards Jews and being told that they're ruling the world, they're setting up this white replacement, they're pulling all of the strings behind the scenes. And of course, since these people have never met a Jewish person, it's a little bit easier to believe that, you know, these are people who are hiding in the shadows, pulling the strings. Some of the ideologies also use distorted Bible interpretations in order to support this view of Jews as the descendants of the devil. And so this is called the 2 seed line theory within the Christian identity ideology. And it says that Adam was the first white man and that Eve was seduced by the snake, which was the devil, and that Eve then had 2 children, Cain and Abel. Cain was actually the devil's child who killed Abel. And so then the ideology goes that white people are the descendants of Adam and their 3rd son, Seth, and that Jews are the descendants of Cain and therefore the devil. And then, so when these people are exiting white supremacism, a lot of times they then meet Jewish people for the very first time. and are surprised to find them very similar, especially meeting very religious Jews who tend to hold conservative values. That's surprising to them. And so it really underlines the importance of exposure and interactions in the rehabilitation and reintegration of people who are leaving white supremacism in order to come in contact with these people that they previously had only heard about quite negatively, but had never really met. And so then we can also talk about the ways that they are bonding over hatred. And this is something that we also talked about within the context of directed hate, that conspiracy theories and disinformation play a really important role because for a number of reasons. First, because they identify a clear enemy other who is causing the grievances, who's responsible for the negative things in one's life that can allow you to relinquish responsibility. It also allows people to feel as though they have access to this secret esoteric knowledge that nobody else has. And so that brings them closer to the other people in their community who do believe in these conspiracy theories and ideologies. And it removes them, isolates them even further from people who don't believe and don't have this secret knowledge that they believe they have. And so the group then also, demands that they believe in this ideology, and it's not like, everybody in it is only pretending to believe in the ideology because they want to get ahead in the group. Many of them are actually believing in this ideology, but often acting upon that ideology is necessary in order to advance within the group. And so we can see that social media can intensify the belief in these conspiracy theories and continued isolation. We can see that with the rise of QAnon in the US. And then also we see that when the ideologies are tied to religious beliefs, specifically like the Christian identity ideology that I just described, they can become a lot more powerful because they're based in beliefs that the person may have already been raised with.
Okay, thank you, Molly. I'm taking over from here. Of course, in all the interviews, we also found out about recruitment strategies because all the formers, including myself, talked about this too. And there's different ways how people get recruited, especially young people get recruited into these movements. And one is really important, especially when we look at last year, and we see it in the media all the time. Active and retired military and law enforcement personnel bring a sense of discipline and weapons and tactical knowledge, but also lend an air of legitimacy to the group. Means these groups are actively praying for former military members, or even active ones and law enforcement members, to get them into their groups for several reasons. One reason is they have experience with weapons. They can bring in paramilitary training, which they also do. These groups have that. They have compounds where they do trainings, paramilitary trainings, that are also often set up by former military members, even active military members and law enforcement members. For example, the group that I led in Germany, we recruited also active police officers and did the same thing. And that helped to bring the discipline into the group, because the group is seeing, okay, if military is joining, if law enforcement is joining, we are that elite that we're talking about all the time. But on the other hand, it's very attractive for the former military members as well, because once they leave the military for whatever reason, there's often a big void in their world, and they try to fill that, and that's all the camaraderie is missing. A rank structure that and Speckhard was talking about before is all of a sudden missing. They don't know where to belong, and very often they already got radicalized in the army as well. I know several formers that are former military members that had to go to Afghanistan or that were in Iraq, and they were trained to hate on Muslims, to dehumanize Muslims, to make it easier to kill and they come back, have this dehumanized version of this enemy already, and that makes it much, much easier also for these groups to plan and to recruit them. And they offer that. They fill that void with that camaraderie, and they offer all these ranks. And that is set up on purpose, because you have a lot of, we talk about that vulnerable youth are targeted for recruitment as well. And you have a vulnerable teenager who is looking for a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, for a purpose. They want to be valuable. And then you have the group, you feel underprivileged. Then you have the group that comes and can offer you a rank, a title, and you can be somebody in a world where you think you're nobody. That just resonates, and that is the same for the retired military members as well, that they get the same feeling of importance through that rank structure. Another version of recruitment is through handing out leaflets, literature, in-person interaction, social media. And even though social media is the most part, and we have the most recruiting on social media, including Anne talked about 4chan, that the Buffalo shooter got radicalized on 4chan, but you have it on the regular apps too, even on TikTok, Instagram, wherever, or on gaming channels, for example, where we hear that all the time, that people get radicalized while they're chatting, while they're gaming, very often these ego shooter games. And this is where other groups, like even jihadist groups, do the same recruiting in those spaces, and white supremacists do exactly the same. But leafleting, for example, handing out actively literature and leaflets is still a thing as well. It happens, not as big as it used to be. The biggest campaign that ever was started in leafleting, which was actually started in Germany with a NPD. It was called Project Schoolyard in 2004 or 2002, 2004, in that area. And they had hate music CDs and handed them out on schoolyards and recruited through that. And that was copied here in the US with a very big CD label, with a record label that was in Minnesota that did the same. They called it also Project Schoolyard USA, and did the same thing, handed out hate CDs on schoolyards and leaflets and literature. And you have also in-person interactions. You know your peers. If you have a couple of friends and the one is standing a little bit more on the right, you know what to say. You can test the waters and then hand out a little bit more literature, or just co-workers or whatever. Also, white supremacist groups create spectacles in order to utilize the mainstream media for exposure and recruitment. And this is a very old tactic, and it always has worked. Unfortunately, it still works sometimes. And what they do is the Klan, the KKK, started this in the 80s, actually, because they knew how to use the media, starting with Jerry Springer, for example. You can Google all these on YouTube. Went to Jerry Springer, but one thing they did, use flyers and spread them in, for example, African-American neighborhoods. And you would think, what's the purpose of this? You can't recruit any members in an African-American neighborhood. But that's not the point. The point was that somebody would call the media, first the police, then the media, the Klan handed out flyers or threw flyers into the driveways. And all of a sudden the media was there, and they would show the flyer, they would show the address, they would show the website, they would show the phone number, and all of a sudden the Klan was sitting back and just waiting to pick up the phone to get a lot of phone calls. And this unfortunately still works, and the media unfortunately has not learned very well from that. But these are the main recruitment strategies that are out there still. Of course, the internet has, since the 2000s, replaced a lot of this, but it all still works. And of course, videos. Humans have the attention span of a goldfish, like 7 to 8 seconds, and this is why we're making these 1-minute videos as well, because a lot of people don't watch the 5-minute videos. They watch the 1-minute videos. It needs to resonate with them immediately, otherwise you lose them. And extremist groups know that as well. and they use the media and use videos and use shorts to find something that resonates, like that subjective truth that is ultimately true for the viewer, that is might be that vulnerable youth. And they're saying something that is ultimately true to the person who's watching. So these guys are right. So they're more perceptible for the next more radical thing they're putting out, because they are the trusted source all of a sudden. And they raise the dose more and more and more. And at the end, you end up with conspiracy theories like the Jews want to take over the world, because most of these people will not buy it immediately. If you hand them literature about a conspiracy theory that the Jews want to take over the world, most people will not buy it in the first place. It happens slowly, that radicalization, by raising the dose, by giving a little bit more based on the former version that you got, that you trust. So this is how recruitment works, and I give it back. I don't know if Anne is next or Molly.
It's me, but I'll go pretty quick so we can make sure to have lots of time for discussion. So a few experiences that we noticed. So in particular, we weren't able to study gender super well in this sample just because it was primarily men in the interview sample, which does reflect the demographics of these groups generally. But from the men's and some of the women's reports as well, women have a lesser role in most groups. They're less often engaged in more violent fights, but rather they're seen as, in some groups, they are certainly taken advantage of and not viewed as having very much worth, but in other groups, they're idealized as mothers who can raise the next generation. And we see this in ISIS as well, that we shouldn't be discounting the role of women in raising their children in this ideology. We also see a difference between the prison-based groups that are a lot more violent, whereas the groups on the outside that are more political and don't overtly advocate for violence, they'll say, we only ever act in self-defense, but are simultaneously inviting attacks by holding rallies, wearing provocative uniforms, flags, signs, and then being able to fight back in self-defense against counter-protesters. But these groups are more political, trying to appear less imposing, less dangerous, so that they might be elected to political office or sway politicians in order to enact policies that are favorable to them. And then finally, we see that there is a role of reciprocal radicalization. Many people referenced violent interactions with people that they identified as being Antifa. Antifa has stated that their goals include basically raising the cost of participating in a white supremacist group. So not necessarily changing people's minds, but rather saying, you're going to lose your job, you're going to lose your family, you're going to be attacked. But what we see is that often it ends up being fuel for the fire, that white supremacists, when attacked by counter-protesters at their events, don't decide, oh, this is too high a cost for me to outwardly participate, but rather it reinforces their view that they need to fight, and that Antifa is out to get them, and that liberals generally are out to get them, and that they need to continue their engagement.
So our next slide is about disengagement. And this is ultimately we want to prevent this. But if people get into it, we want to get them out of it. And basically what we found is that when people walked away from white supremacism, it was really common to have ebbs and flows in engagement. So they would have doubts. And I want to emphasize that a lot of these people were really intelligent people. There were some where you thought, okay, I can see how you'd be fooled by anything, but a lot of them were really intelligent. TM's an example of that. He's a genius, and he was in it, although he was a leader. And but they start to have doubts, But then they have to give up so much to leave. They have to give up their entire friendship. Sometimes they're married into it. They might have business in it. It's become their world because these groups have isolated them from everyone else. And then if they have permanent markers on their bodies, tattoos. I mean, we worked with one person or interviewed one person that had Aryan nations all across his face. And he said everywhere he goes, people do terrible things to him and hate him automatically, even though he has now left this group. This is really hard for him. So the work that TM's doing on erasing the hate is extremely important as a first step to be able to say, you know, I want to take these marks of hate off of me. I don't want to be part of this. And then also, if you have marks of hate on your body, other people, you know, can try to pull you back in because they assume you're still in it. We found that doxing has a serious effect. It has two effects. One, if you're strongly in it, it's a mark of pride. So people brag about that they got doxed. They're happy they got doxed. They get more prestige in the group for getting doxed. But some people, even if they were strongly in it, if it affected their job, if it affected things with their family, they began to think, maybe I need to get out. So one woman got out because she thought that she wasn't going to be able to get a job after graduating. So it's pluses and negatives. We found, just like with ISIS, that spontaneous de-radicalization is a thing, meaning that people can de-radicalize all on their own. And that in the case of white supremacism, it usually occurred via positive interactions with members of minority groups. So we want to emphasize that minority groups have no responsibility to address white supremacism, but when they do, when they're kind to somebody that has tattoos, when they say just little words showing empathy, showing that you're a human being, and showing themselves as a positive and good force, they start to break through this. And that was the breaking point for many people that walked away on their own. Unfortunately, in the US and Germany, there's good programs. One of our colleagues, Tori Borges, started Exit Sweden, right? I always get mixed up. No, Exit Norway. And then it was copied by Sweden, Germany, and other countries. And it's a really good program, gets a lot of government support. But here in the US, we don't find that as much. So there's a lot of barriers and bridges to disengagement. One is being in an echo chamber of isolation. Tattoos, as I said. Some of our respondents had gone to therapists and said the therapist was afraid of them and ill-equipped to deal with people trying to exit from hate groups. And friends, family, and finances can all be a barrier to exit, especially if your family's still in the group and doesn't want to leave. And exiting is very psychologically and socially stressful. They need a lot of intensive help, usually not once a week that a therapy session could provide if there were even therapists that weren't afraid to address it. But, you know, late night calls, TM does a lot of this and finds that, you know, it's really intensive when you're working with someone that wants to leave. So we will stop here and open it for questions. And on the last slide, you'll just see our emails, and feel free to contact us if you'd like to. And we will be sending these slides around. So thank you all for your attention. And I hope that we were helpful in informing on this very serious subject.
Thank you very much, Anne, Molly, and TM. We will, of course, be posting the video and any documents, slides, contact information that you're willing to share. Remind everybody, please post your questions in the Q&A function of Zoom. I have one for you, and I'm not trying to be provocative here, but when I was doing a very similar bit of work with the gangs of Central America and both in Central America and in the US, I was always struck by the kind of moral hazard of how to work with these groups while protecting their rights to privacy. You mentioned doxing earlier. Release of information could be actually deadly, or get them arrested on the other hand. So how do you go about protecting the rights of those that have been interviewed? And are there any challenges that you fear, or of both the groups that they're coming from or of the law enforcement? So that's kind of a rambling, long-winded question, but I will get to the others. So please put your questions in the Q&A while we wait for Anne and Molly or TM to answer that one.
Well, we follow a really strict informed consent protocol, and we explain exactly what we're doing, and we give people the option to refuse to answer certain questions. We warn them ahead of time. Don't tell us about things that you could be prosecuted for that law enforcement doesn't already know about. So don't incriminate yourself, basically. Then they have the option to have it be a confidential interview, that their name will never be associated with it or any identifying details, or they can take part in the counter-narrative video, and then we explain that very carefully to them, and they can take part in that with their real name and their face showing, or with their face blurred out and a fake name. In the case of ISIS, most people didn't want their real name, so they used their ISIS kunya. In the case of white supremacists, I was surprised how many said, yes, I would like other people to be saved from this. And I'm really willing to use my face and my name. A few were worried about retaliation and opted out, but very few. Go ahead, Tian.
It's also important to see that there's a big difference if you talk about gangs, where money plays a much bigger role, and the gang structure is way more worried about having that structure being harmed, and therefore the livelihood. And there's often, these are mafia, really mob-like structures that are there. While if you look at political-oriented or religious-oriented hate groups, it's a little bit different. There's not as much at stake, especially not money, especially not a criminal empire behind it. It's a little bit different when it comes to prison gangs. People that come out of prison gangs might be more hesitant to talk about it and have their name out there, and have just are afraid of retaliation than former members of political or religious hate groups, because these people are dangerous, but it is fortunately much easier to leave those groups without retaliation than Hollywood movies or the media wants you to make you believe. And unfortunately, those groups make you believe that you can leave, so you don't leave. But actually, it's fairly easy to leave without retaliation, and long-term members know that. And we have a lot of our interviews where the participants were long-term members of these groups, and they know that. That's why so many were willing to talk as well.
Okay. A couple of questions here from attendees. The first one is, did your subjects display the same feeling of trust toward other white supremacist groups that were external to their own group? Were there any rivalries or lack of mutual trust across different groups?
Well, I would say we found that NSM, that's National Socialist Movement, and the Klan oftentimes planned rallies together. But then the NSM would get angry at the Klan because the Klan didn't follow their nonviolent policies, or they came in their robes and they didn't want them to come in their robes. So there were definitely different points of view. But I would say there was a lot of trust. I mean, TM, you probably can address that better than I can. It wasn't a question we asked.
In general, from my experience and how I still see it today, is that it depends. Look at it a little bit like January 6th last year. It depends on your goal on your short-term goal or what you're doing for the rally. If you have a common denominator for the day, then you can build your trust on this denominator for depending what it is. Like, for example, January 6th, ultranationalism and the big lie. So you base it on this. And that will work. Long term, you have much more rivalries, especially between different clan groups. And so the clan, and I know there's one particular clan group that always worked with the NSM, but there's like hundreds of small clan groups because since the 1940s, the KKK doesn't exist anymore. These are many splinter groups that are fight each other. There's no trust. Sometimes they even ban each other from going to their events, and you get kicked out of groups. And it depends also, you have more religious hate groups. They don't want the pagan members, and there's no trust. But again, like Anne said, when it comes to events like, for example, rallies, and you have a common denominator there, and that could be a certain topic that's in the media, it could be political, it could be religious, then the trust is based on there and is there for a certain amount of time. And then, yes, absolutely.
Again, just to remind everybody, if you've got any questions, please post them to the Q&A function in Zoom. I have another one here from Jen R. Lee. Thank you for this wonderful and informative presentation. I had a question with regards to extremists who engage in violence. Based on your research, were you able to identify any significant differences between those who espouse violent rhetoric but don't engage in violent behaviors themselves versus those who actually carry out violent behavior? Are there any distinct characteristics that separate violent extremists versus those who simply engage in violent rhetoric without exhibiting or actualization of physical violence?
That's a good question, Jen. And I would say it goes back to this whole thing with insiders. So like Jeff Shoup said that he was very strict with his group. He was the leader of the National Socialist Movement. And he was very strict with his group. He didn't want them engaging in violence, except for self-defense. Yet a lot of the members said that they did take weapons training, separate from the group, and they were fighting with Antifa all the time, supposedly in self-defense. And certainly the rhetoric was inciting other people into violence. And we saw that those that were part of skinheads and fighting was routine for them. And some of the respondents told us people would fight at the end of the night, no matter what. And they would fight with each other if they couldn't find anybody else to fight with, and that it was a real drinking culture. So I think some of these people were raised in violent homes, angry, and they just are constantly moving to violence as a way to express their rage. But I don't know, Molly, maybe you have more to say on that.
Yeah, I think it's just important to recognize these ideologies are violent. And so there is a difference in tactics, in that some groups might say, long-term, yes, there will be a race war, but short-term, we need to be, getting our people into politics, or we need to be enacting change in other ways. So they don't want people just getting into street fights because it ruins their reputation. It's not that they're opposed to violence generally, but rather that they don't see violence as being conducive to their goals, whereas other groups that might be just, a little bit less organized, not having the long-term goals in terms of holding political office and things like that, prison gangs, skinhead groups that are just, younger, more interested in fighting generally. But the ideologies itself, whether they're inciting other people to violence or they're holding back so that they can enact mass violence once they get enough power, it is all violence, but it's depending on goals and individual characteristics.
I guess I would just jump in too and say, when we look at this Buffalo shooter, we have to become aware now that people can get radicalized into violence pretty quickly, within a year or two, and, sometimes in weeks. But anyway, I don't know, TM, do you want the last word? And Molly had to unfortunately run to the next meeting.
No, that's no problem. I agree 100% with what you just said. Radicalization can happen very quickly, unfortunately, thanks to the internet, that people, and it's dehumanizing. You dehumanize the other, whoever the other is, take their humanity away, and all of a sudden it's so much easier to hurt somebody. And let me give you one quick example how quick dehumanization works and how quick people will become physical. An experiment I did this year, the Friday before MLK Day, in the Jewish school in Memphis. And it was middle class, like middle schoolers. So I asked them, those kids, I asked them, does anybody feel like cauliflower? And like 3 kids did. So I picked one of them 3, and his name was AJ. So I said, so AJ, so you like cauliflower? I said, yeah. So would you like it if the other people would call you cauliflower head from now on? Would you like it? He said, no, of course not. And his seating neighbor, very obviously somebody who didn't like cauliflower, started calling him cauliflower head like 3 times and started pushing him around. And I said, so how was it pushing the cauliflower head around? He said, yeah, that was cool. But would you like to push around AJ, your friend? And no, actually not. So within a second, I took the kid's humanity and I dehumanized the kid within a second, and made it possible for his friend to become physical. He started pushing him around in front of the rabbi, in front of the principal, and in front of me. And it happened within a finger snip, a second. He became physical. And now multiply that with the internet, with a hateful message, and within a week or 2, you could be ready to politically to chase down the racists, chase down the racist the street and hit them over the head, or chase the baby killer down the street and hit him over the head. That's so much easier than Jack or Jill. You know what I mean? It's so dangerous right now, and social media makes it so easy to put the evil stamp, the demonizing actually stamp on people and completely dehumanize them within days, weeks. And again, we've seen it with the Buffalo shooter. And that is really, really concerning.
Folks, I'm going to try and paraphrase the last couple of questions. And so, TM, I'm going to suggest maybe, because one of them is, could we outline some of the sites that host this supremacist content? So if you know of a few, maybe you could just put them into the chat. The other question is a good segue to the Boston shooter, and I'm not going to mention his name here, but I believe he plagiarized, used something upwards of 70% of the Christchurch shooter's manifesto, and made some strong references to it. There is some evidence that white supremacist groups are globally networked to each other. What can you say about the networking of these groups in the US, and to what countries and to what groups? How are they networked? Any meetings, any joint training programs among them?
Well, I'd say in our sample, people traveled from country to country, and TM is an example of that. And that some of these groups are linked from US, from Canada to Europe, to the UK, to New Zealand, and Australia. So, now with the internet, that's all linked, and not only linked by internet, but also by physical travel. So, the groups come together in rallies, and these are times when there's lots of crossover. And as far as them reacting to mass shootings, it's the same as with the militant jihadists. If you go way too far, some people get really turned off and say, oh, that shouldn't have happened. And other people get really excited. So we see a lot of copycat crimes. And we see, like the guy that we interviewed that wanted to do the synagogue shooting, he wanted to emulate the shooter that had gone into the Black church. And he wanted to do as good as him. And the New Zealand shooter is constantly referenced by these groups on the internet of, we have to do something like him. And this is all over social media. Acacia Dietz from the NSM told us that when Facebook was taking them down, they figured out how to be less offensive on Facebook. So they didn't say things that would result in a takedown policy. And then they would migrate you off to something else, which is the same as what ISIS does. You know, you can get people on Telegram, WhatsApp, you know, something that's encrypted, and but you start them off on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, and you know, much as we have good takedown policies, they're not catching it all.
Okay, so if I understand, Anne, there is a kind of a reaction to, say, attacks in a supermarket, grocery store. Some that may entice some people, as it may put some people off. It's one of the questions I'm trying to paraphrase here.
Yeah, so like Jeff told us and Acacia told us that when Charlottesville happened and there were deaths, that they were just so turned off and they wanted to leave because of it. And other people said similar things. But on the other hand, there's people that want to emulate these killers, and especially when we do say their names and when they appear in their sick minds to be glorified. And you know, it's an echo chamber when you're inside one of these chat groups. You're hearing everybody cheer the person on. I mean, the New Zealand shooter had his live shooting played over and over again by other people in these groups internationally. So for them, they see, oh, I can be famous too, and they want to do a copycat crime.
Okay, which is a segue into what I'm going to call our last question. We will try and post the websites that host supremacist separately. So this question is the kind of the salad bar, the fluidity of the fringes, or ideological convergence. Recently, these are terms that mean the ideological transition from the embrace of one form of violent extremism to another. How common has it been to see these ideological transitions for white supremacist groups? And to what ideology, jihadist or left wing, are they transiting?
Well, we're definitely seeing in the book, I'm losing the name of it now, but the one that the Oklahoma shooting was based off of, we saw a suicide mission. Yeah, the Turner Diaries. Thank you so much. Sorry, I've had a concussion, so I'm not all here. But we saw discussion of a suicide operation, but now that there's overlap and people are watching what the militant jihadists are doing, they're saying, you know, this is a really lethal way of attacking, and that nobody can stop you, and, you know, basically a smart bomb. And they're talking about doing suicide operations and being murdered for the cause, where martyrdom has absolutely nothing to do with white supremacism. And, you know, the whole concept is mistakenly taken from Islam. So we're seeing crossover, and we even saw some people say we wanted to team up with ISIS or Al-Qaeda because we had the common enemy of the Jews. So there definitely is crossover. Maybe you want to say more on that, TM.
That's exactly what I was talking earlier with that common denominator. And sometimes it's also the smallest common denominator. When we talk about a crossover of jihadists or militant jihadists, to be correct, and white supremacists, the smallest common denominator would be the common enemy, the Jews in that case. And you had in the first Iraq war in the 90s, you had white supremacists from all over the world going fight for Saddam Hussein. They were called the Iraqis, were the Germans of the East, and they were helping Saddam Hussein down there. You saw it later with the Ayatollah in Tehran when he held the Holocaust conference down there. You had people like David Irving, a very well-known British Holocaust denier, or Ernst Zundel from Canada, a German a German Austrian in Canada, I believe he's dead now, but they all traveled down there and worked together with Muslim groups that are completely actually very often the enemies. And you can trace that back to actually World War II, where you had, like, in the Waffen SS, you had Muslim members from Bosnia that had their own units in the Waffen SS because they had the smallest common denominator, the Jews. And for today, we are friends. And what happens tomorrow, we will see. Because once you have taken care of the common enemy, that smallest common denominator, you will see, okay, this is all we had in common. But this is often what these groups, they don't think that far. They have this goal, a long-term goal, and on this way to this long-term goal, today you can help me. This is all we're going to think about. And I have to trace back to January 6th again, last year. And one very good example for that is you had one guy in the crowd that had a Holocaust, a t-shirt that glorified the Holocaust in the crowd. And in the same crowd, there was an Orthodox Jew from New York. How is this possible that two people that stand so contrary to each other, with so contrary beliefs, be in the same crowd and fighting for the same thing that day? Because they had the smallest common denominator there. And that was the big lie, like the big lie of the stolen election. And they were both ultra-nationalists. So therefore, they had a common goal, a common denominator. What happens tomorrow was unimportant. We're taking care of today. And you see that all over. And recruitment also, how it works across borders, you see today as well that and I said it, there were mercenaries going into Iraq. You had mercenaries going into Bosnia in the 90s, in the war there, due to ethnic cleansing. And you have that now, which is not much in the media, unfortunately, but ultra-nationalist parts in Ukraine, in East Ukraine, are recruiting worldwide neo-Nazis, and they go in there, and that happens all on Telegram, and they have the meeting points there. So that's all out there, and you have that, and they don't care if it's a Jewish president. The smallest common denominator they have there is, even if your fighting buddy is maybe a loyal one to the Jewish president, and you're not, but you can fight the Bolsheviks right now, like in World War II. And this is the smallest common denominator again. Today, we are friends because we're fighting the Bolsheviks. If your president is a Jew, I don't care today. It might look different tomorrow. So this is very important to see these developments as well, these short-term friendships there and crossovers.
Well, thank you, Anne, TM, and Molly. Not the happiest of subject for a Monday morning, but an important one nonetheless. I'd like to thank everybody for your good questions. Again, to the panelists for the great responses, and everybody who signed on to this session. We have another one planned in early June. We'll get the details out to everybody as soon as possible. Again, the recording will be made available on our website, and any documents that Anne and the group share with us. So again, without much further ado, thank you very much, everybody, and we will see you soon.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you to the participants. Sorry we didn't get to the last question. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.